Okay, so just to get our bearings as to where we were yesterday, we are still on Lamed Aleph, Amid Aleph. We had just seen the Mishnah, and the Mishnah brings a machlokes as to whether if a young chasam on his wedding night wants to recite Kriya Shema, even though he's exempt, does he have a right to do so? The Tanakama says, go right ahead. It's up to you. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, "Lo kol harotza litol es Hashem yavo v'yitol." Not everyone who wants to invoke God's name has a right to invoke it, meaning that there's a certain um, maybe disrespect that you would be showing to Hashem's name if you are not able to muster the proper kavana in reciting Kriya Shema, and also it may be an act of arrogance to consider yourself capable of something that only a very lofty person is capable of doing, which is, despite all of the distraction and nervousness of your wedding night, you're able to maintain your composure and recite Kriya Shema. So what that had brought us to was a brisa that we began yesterday, that there are certain things that if a person wishes to imitate a Talmud Chacham in his behavior, he's permitted to do, even though he himself is not a Talmud Chacham. And it's only when it comes to acts of self-deprivation. So, for example, if a person would like to comport himself um, as a Talmud Chacham when it comes to fasting. So, like we explained yesterday, that when there's a drought, the initial fasting was only done by the Talmidei Chachamim, by the rabbinic leaders. But if you want to fast with them, you have a right to fast with them, because since your act is an act of self-deprivation, so we're not worried that this is going to cause you to become arrogant. But v'chol davar shehu shel shevach, but anything that involves giving yourself praise, because you're comporting yourself in a more respectable way. And the example that he says in the commentary is uchegon, either like reciting Kriya Shema when you're in a state of nervousness, um, uh, because there's no self-deprivation there. You're just holding yourself up as someone that's holier than thou. And he says in the commentary, Uchagon levishat beged mechubad shel talmid chacham, or wearing an honorific garment like a talmid chacham. So he says in the footnote 15 in the second paragraph, he says, Bebavli, muvash al talmid chacham lihitlabesh b'tzura mechubedet. The Talmud Bavli explains that a talmid chacham has to wear honorable clothing. The Gemara there explains what the clothing of a Talmud Chacham is supposed to look like. I guarantee you it's not anything like what Talmidei Chachamim look like today, because we developed that clothing more in Europe than anywhere else. The black frock and the Hamburg and stuff like that. Od muva bebavli shetalmidei chachamim hayanoagim lino ne'alayim b'tzeva shachor la'otzar al churban Yerushalayim. It's also brought down that Talmidei Chachamim used to wear shoes that were blackened, even though normally the tone of your shoe was more in the tone of leather. They used to deliberately blacken Talmidei Chachamim shoes to show that they were in pain over the destruction of the temple. That's not anymore the standard either. But the point is that if you dress yourself in the manner of a Talmid Chacham, you're demonstrating that you're behaving in a way that I guess is sort of patting yourself on the back and showing that you're holier than thou. So lo kol harotza lasos atzmo yachid osa. Not everyone has a right to make him a Talmud. The lo kol harotza lasos atzmo yachid osa. Not everyone has a right to make himself into a unique individual, and Talmud Chacham osa. And not everyone who wants to make himself into a Talmud Chacham is allowed to do so. Ela imkein minu oso parnasalat tzibor. He says the only exception is if you're the communal leaders, and therefore it's your role in the community to wear that to be that kind of person. He says even though you don't feel you're worthy of it, but since you're playing a role in the community leadership, then it's appropriate for you to comport yourself in that way and to wear those kinds of garments. Someone asked me, "Are you going to be still wearing ties when you go to make Aliyah?" And I said, absolutely not. Yeah. So not if I can avoid it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, part of it is because no one wears ties in Eretz Yisrael. But anyway, so now the Gemara says, Tani, so now we have a brisa to show a story that is, but first we're going to bring a different brisa as an introduction to that brisa. So mistalkin litzidadim, he says travelers are allowed to turn to the sides of the road, even though they may be stepping on the edges of fields that belong to other people. Mipnei yesedos hadarachim. And the reason is because sometimes in the summer there are thorns that may be found in the road. And as a result, you're allowed to, or clumps of earth is the way he explains it. And so therefore, if you find yourself in the middle of a path that has these clumps of very sharp earth, and you want to avoid them from harming the bottoms of your feet, you are allowed to walk on the sides of the road, even though you may be treading on someone's private property. Uvishashu mishtakeya, but when it's when the ground is muddy, so that you're stepping into the mud that's on the pathway, and therefore it's harder to travel. You're also afilu bisada. You're even allowed to shumaleya korkamin. You're even allowed to step on a field that is filled with saffron plants, which means that even though you may actually be causing damage to someone else's field, but if the pathway is flooded or muddy and you're not able to traverse it, permission is granted to public travelers to step on private property. And the question is, why is that? He says, because the mud is even harder to get yourself out of, and therefore, now there are. So this means that even though damage may be caused to the private property owners, it's still considered to be permissible. And the question is, the Yerushalmi in another place asks the question, do you have to pay if you end up damaging the guy's plants? So in the bottom paragraph of the footnote, he says, "V'hatakana ha'isa shu rashai ligrom lebalan sada nezek al menas l'shalem o shu poter milashalem." When we say you're allowed to walk on his field, does that mean you have to be prepared to pay him back if you do cause him damage or not? Umasikim shemikach shabraisa mosifa shirashai likanes afilu l'sladei karkom mashma shu poter milashalem. He says, it seems from the Brisa that when it says permission is granted even to walk on a field that is growing saffron, that no matter what damage you cause, you're going to be exempt from paying damages. So basically, we're taking a very liberal attitude towards public pedestrians, that we give them permission that if a person's property is abutting a public thoroughfare, that the private field owner has to be prepared in certain levels of damage from the travelers. Now, there's a story, however, about a Talmid Chacham who was machmir in this respect. In other words, the Yerushalmi is really implicitly asking the question, is a person allowed to be machmir and not step on someone else's property, or is he behaving in an arrogant way by saying, "Oh, I'm a very holy person. I refuse to take advantage of the opportunity to step on someone else's property. So Amar Rabbi Avahu, Ma'aseh b'Rabban Gamliel v'Rabbi Yehoshua, Shahayu b'derech v'hayu mistalkin litzadim. There was once a story of Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua that when they were traveling, they would step on other people's fields to avoid the hazards in the road, Bipnei Yesedos Hadrachim, because of the thorns and the thistles and the clumps that were in the road. V'ro is Rabbi Yehuda ben Papus shahaya mishtakeya uba kenegdan. But they saw that Rabbi Yehuda ben Papus was stepping even in the mud on the roads and not taking advantage of other people's fields. And he was coming and and he was coming towards them. Amar Rabban Gamliel Rabbi Yehoshua mihu zeh mare atzmo be'etzba. And so Rabban Gamliel turns to Rabbi Yehoshua and he says, "Who is this guy? Shemare atzmo be'etzba." That he sort of he's pointing to himself. He's bringing attention to himself, basically implying that I'm such a machmir, that I'm so special that I won't even allow myself to step on other people's property. Amar lo Yehuda ben Papusu shekol masav l'shem shamayim. So Rabbi Yehoshua said, no, he's a good guy. His name is Yehuda ben Papus, and everything that he does is for the sake of heaven. And don't worry, he's not doing it because he's an arrogant person. So Amar lei, but Rabban Gamliel still was disapproving of his behavior. V'lo kein tani kol davar shu shel shevach lo kol arotza lasos atzmo yachid osa. But didn't we learn that unless it's a matter of self-deprivation, you're not allowed to publicly bring attention to yourself as being a very special person? You're not supposed to be doing that. And not everyone Talmud Chachamos, and not everyone is supposed to make him out into a Torah scholar. Elim kein minu so parnas alat sibur. So he says, for a person to be behaving in public with such piety, with such extra chumrah power, is not something that's appropriate. And apparently he was not known as such a scholar. He was known as some people knew him as a very pious guy, as a very, he was a bit of he was very machmir on himself, but he wasn't known as a great Torah scholar at this point. And therefore Rabban Gamliel was critical of him. So Amar lei v'hatani kol davar shel tsar kol arosa lasas atzmo yachidasa v'talmid chacham oseh v'tavo alav bracha. But didn't we learn in that self-same brisa that if it's a matter of self-deprivation, that you are allowed to, even though you're doing it publicly? And here's this guy, Rabbi Yehuda ben Papus, who's is getting himself all dirty by stepping into mud. And he's doing an act of self-deprivation. And so why don't you consider this something that's permissible, that the brisa says you are allowed to do it? Because he's not elevating himself. He's only degrading himself by allowing himself to step in the mud. So that's how the story ends. And that's, Rabbi Gamliel, I guess, didn't have a response to that. And so Rabbi Yehuda ben Papus was defended by Rabbi Yehoshua. Now, we have another Amora who wishes to add to this story. Amar Rabbi Ze'era, but Rabbi Ze'era sort of, I guess, is defending Rabban Gamliel's criticism. Uvilcho de lo yivza choranin. He says, when the brisa says that you're allowed to act with self-deprivation, even if you're not a Talmud Chacham, that's when you're not causing other people to look bad. That's when you're not causing other people to look bad, and so you're not supposed to do it in front of other people. So he says, but because Rabbi Yehuda ben Papus was doing this in front of two sages who were stepping on the side of the road, it made the other two sages look bad. And therefore, Rabban Gamliel's criticism was a valid criticism. And therefore, he shouldn't have been doing it. As soon as he saw these two other rabbis stepping to the side of the road, he should have stepped to the side of the road on private property as well.
So if there's no Talmidei Chacham around, it's okay.
Yeah, as long as you're doing something that involves self-deprivation, self-degradation, and no one else is present. So then you can go ahead and do it.
Or someone's on the same level as you.
Or if you truly are a community leader and you want to demonstrate piety because of your stature, so then that's also okay. But to do something that's very, very ascetic and very pietistic, and to do it publicly, even if it involves self-deprivation, especially when Talmidei Chachamim are not acting in that pietistic way, that's not appropriate to do. So I'm just reminded of, the yeshiva bachers that come back from their holy place in Israel. And when they come back and then they start davening Shemona Esrei in a prominent place, and, are like what they're gesticulating with their hands and
What's the word?
gesticulating. Yeah.
Everybody.
And as if you and I, Ribono Shel Olam, we're best friends. Don't pay attention to any of these other peasants. I just have to get my words across to you. In other words, that's the part that a person may be looking at that and say, come on, dude, get with the program. In other words, if you want to daven like that in the privacy of your own home, fine. You want to make whatever motions you want to make, that your whole Shemona Esrei is kol atzmosai tomarno, all of my limbs will cower and submit before you, Hashem, and I'll use my entire body to daven Shemona Esrei. But if you're in a public prayer space, have a little modesty as well, and have all of that kavana without having to express it with your arms and your shuckling. In other words, there should be a sense of modesty when you're expressing yourself religiously, right? You understand the point of what this Gemara is trying to point out. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Dolima, there was a certain story, Rebbe Miyasha, Rebbe Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Havu Yasvin Ochlin Bachada min Elein Kinishta Aliyasa. These two sages were sitting and eating together in one of the attics, one of the second stories of the Beis HaKnesses of the shul. Asas onasa ditzlosa. It came time to daven mincha. The kam Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak mitzaliyah. And so Rabbi Shmuel, one of the two guys, so it's Rabbi Miyasha and Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Shmuel says, Ashul Digmir, I'm going to get started. He gets up and he says, I'm going to go daven mincha. And Omar Lei, Rabbi Miyasha, Lokain Alfan Rebbe, but our Rebbe taught us that even though you're not supposed to begin a meal before it's time to daven mincha, if you know that mincha is about, this time of davening mincha is about to arrive, but in his chilu ein mafsikin. But if you started your meal, you're not obligated to interrupt your meal as soon as the Zman Mincha arrives. You can finish your Seudah and then daven Mincha. Like, why are you being so frum that in the middle of the meal, you're interrupting yourself? Oh, we got to daven Mincha. Okay, like why are you being so frum? So, Vitani Chizkiya, Kol Mishu Hu Pater Midavar Ve'osehu Nikra Hedjot. And don't we have a principle that Chizkiya once taught, that if a person is exempt from something and does it, in other words, and is machmir to do it anyway, you're considered to be a commoner. In other words, sometimes there's a greater advantage to a person who knows the heter and relies on the heter than someone who says, oh, we got to be machmir, okay? And if you take a look at the footnote number 9, Lomar, lo rak she'eno mosif al erko b'maisezeh. Not only is a person not adding to his esteem by being so machmir, by interrupting his meal to daven mincha, elahu af od morid me'erko, but he's also actually lowering his stature. Why? Ve'atam lekach mishum shehamachmir bedavar shepater mimenu nira kemisyair. Because if you're machmir on something that the halacha doesn't require you to do, it looks like you're being extra frum for no reason, and that might be a form of arrogance, or it might be a form of ignorance, okay? Mem rezu shekol misha pater midavar v'oseyu nikra hedjot heviu harishonim. He says, and it's something that's expanded upon by the Rishonim. We're not going to have time to go into this whole idea of being machmir when you don't have to. But the Gemara in the Bavli in Brachos also expands upon this thing. The Gemara points out that there's a debate whether you should say the bracha, is it ha-motzi lechem min haaretz or motzi lechem min haaretz? And the Gemara says that everyone agrees that motzi lechem min haaretz without the hay is an acceptable form. But Talmidei Chachamim use the hay to demonstrate that even though they know that there's a machlokes, they want to show that they know how to paskin. In other words, there are times when being machmir is a sign of ignorance and arrogance and not a sign of sophistication and piety. So you have to know when to apply this. So what Rav Miyasha was pointing out to Rav Shmuel, chill out. You don't have to stop eating in the middle of your meal just because the time to daven has arrived. Don't you know the halacha? You're not actually adding to your esteem. You're diminishing from your esteem by trying to be so machmir when you don't have to. Okay, that's what he was. You like this Gemara, how much?
Yeah, but what happens if
Okay.
that was the only time I had a minion at that time?
Okay,
Yeah,
then
that's a different story.
that may be something else.
But I mean, just in general.
Do we have to stop now?
No.
I thought, I didn't understand why you were.
You got me thinking about the other one put down from the Big Lebowski, which was when John Goodman says, Erev Shabbos, and the dude says, dude, get over yourself, you're not even Jewish. Yeah, that's awesome. Anyway, that's how I'm distracted.
Okay, so anyway,
Robin, where do you draw the line? It's like, there's so many things today, like just application.
okay, so it's
Big discussion.
it's a big discussion. Let's finish the Gemara first. Let's finish the story and see how Reb Shmuel and Rav Miyasha are sort of come to some kind of reconciliation. So Omar Lay, so Reb Shmuel turns back to Rav Miyasha and says, but v'hataninan chasen pater, but don't we, what about the Mishnah? The Mishnah says that a chasen is exempt from reciting Kriya Shema on his wedding night, but chasen imrotze. But if he wants to recite Kriya Shema, and even though he's exempt, that he's allowed to be machmir on himself. So you see that not everyone agrees with Chizkiah, that if you're machmir on a halacha, you're called a boor, or you're called a hedjot, a commoner. So Rav Miyasha says, no. There's a difference between the Mishnah and what you're doing. So Amar Lei, so Rav Miyasha says back to him, Yochel ani potar. He says the Tana of our Mishnah that permits a chassan to recite Kriya Shema, he says ki Rabban Gamliel. The Rabban Gamliel Amar Eini shomea lochem levatel mimeni malchus shamayim. That goes like Rabban Gamliel, who said in the previous Mishnah that he insisted on reciting Kriya Shema on the wedding night. He says, because I want to invoke Hashem's name. He says, and as the commentary says, Umekeven Shimon Gamliel, Sir Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel b'Mishnah Seinu Cholek al Svarazu, v'sover shechasin eni yochel lahachmer al atzma v'likros, and he says, my father could do that, but not everyone who wants to do that can do that. Ha-halacha kemoso. V'zu das habraishas shoshana chizkiya sheino dam rashai lahachmer al atzma b'makom shepater. And in other words, it's a machlokes tanoim. You're right. And we paskin like Chizkiah, we paskin like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, and therefore you shouldn't. And like he says in footnote number 12, Rabbi Miyasha doiche shedas tanakam b'mishnasenu shechasim r'shay lahachmir afshi histam mishnu v'derech klal halacha kistam mishnah he rak das yachid shel ben Gamliel. He says that Mishnah that says that if you want to be machmir and recite Kriya Shema the night of your wedding, you have permission, even though it's a Stam Mishnah, it's not mentioned in the name of one person. Nonetheless, we don't paskin that way. Umikeven Shemon Shimon Gamliel b'Mishnah Seinu Cholik al Deyazu v'sover shechasan eino rashai lahachmir al atzmo klal hu shehalacha Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. We normally paskin like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Ucheshita zu shenuya habraisa sheshana Chizkiya, and that's how Chizkiya is learning. The Alfal Pisha Mishim Gamliel b'Mishnasenu Noke Lo Kol Arotz Litolas Hashem Yitol Mash Meshavu Modeh Shemisha Meforsim B'Chasidus Shel Achmer Latzmo L'Das Rabbi Miyasha Kavani Hirak L'Gadol Hador Rabbi Gamliel. He says, and he was basically, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was saying, only the Gadol Hador can be machmir like that. But Rav Miyasha, you shouldn't be machmir in something that you don't have to be machmir, especially because you know that the halacha doesn't require you to do that. And that's how a Talmud Chacham should comport himself. Okay, Hadron Allah Hayakari. Okay, so now we're ready for some conversation, Moshe. So that's how the story ended, basically, is that Rav Miyasha seems to have prevailed in the story, basically telling him, chill out. You know, you don't have to stop in the middle of your meal just because it's time to daven mincha. Okay, we have time. The halacha permits you to finish the meal, finish your meal, and then we'll go daven mincha. Okay.
So stuff like, holding Rabbeinu Tam and he's keeping Shabbos later, or, I gotta put on, 6 different pairs of tefillin. I gotta have another, like, where do you draw the line of what is
Considered to be over the top,
over the top
and
versus what is someone l'shem shemaim? So I would think if someone's l'shem shemaim, it's a good thing. What, knock yourself out. But where does it become gaiva? Where does it become your beings? It's too much. Where it's not. And there's so many things you can talk. You could use as examples.
So here's what I would tell you. Like, I know a guy in our shul who puts on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin after the regular davening. But the fact is, he's a Baal Tshuva, and when he became a Baal Tshuva, his Rebbe taught him that's what you should do. So people who know him recognize that he's not doing that out of gaiva. Now, a person who doesn't know him and may come to the shul for the first time, and see this guy putting on a second pair of tefillin, even then they would say, okay, maybe he's a Lubavitcher, because Chabad, they're very machmir about that. Chabad feels that it's not just an added chumrah, they feel that it's a halachic imperative, just like Chalav Yisrael. They feel it's a halachic imperative, and we look upon it as a chumrah. Okay? So, any time that there's the opportunity to interpret someone as doing something because he comes from a certain circle of Jews that they hold that to be not just a chumrah, but a halachic requirement. So you should.
Like the Arab, they don't hold a bear of Lubavitch either. The Arab, they will carry on Shabbos.
Right. The thing that I've been critical of in the past is when a guy won't hold of the Erev, but he'll tell his wife to hold of the Erev, and he'll tell her to carry. To me, that number one, that's arrogance over his wife, and number two, it's making himself holier at someone else's expense. So I remember years ago when I was living in LA, there was a guy who didn't hold of the Erev, but when he wanted something to be carried with the stroller, he made his wife push the stroller, made his wife take the kid. And I said to him, that doesn't seem right to me, that you're making your wife do all this work just because you don't want to hold of the Erev. He says, why? I can be machmir if I want to. Just, tell my wife she can do what she wants. But I said, yeah, but if it comes at her expense, I don't think that's a good thing. Anyway, he didn't listen to me, but that's okay. He wanted to be machmir.
Is Rabbeinu Tam timing machmir, or just completely different when he holds Shabbos is at?
It's a machlokas when when Seis HaKochavim arrives. So a person who wishes to add on to Shabbos, Tavo alav bracha, she should be blessed. It depends how public he is about doing it. A lot of people, for example, I accepted upon myself a certain chumrah when I was in yeshiva, and I do it, and I'm machmir in this certain practice, but it's not something that's visible to anyone unless they know what I'm doing.
What is it?
If I tell you, I'll have to kill you. Right? So
actually, with like regular people who put on Rabbeinu Tam as well. I've seen people do it.
Yeah.
Like not Labab, it's just,
people who come to a certain point in their life and they say, okay, I've been going a minyan for my entire life, putting on tefillin every day. I want to go to something higher. And sometimes you do have a right to do that.
So there's nothing, is
It
there-
depends how public the action is. You know, if you're doing it in a very ostentatious way, so then you're coming to this violation of this halacha. You know, so you just have to be careful how public you want to be about the way that you don't flaunt your frumkeit is basically the theme of today's, right? Dude, you're not even Jewish, right? From the Big Lebowski. Yeah.
So somebody dubbing Nate's, which is honorable thing, is that overboard also, or just? doing it
No,
public?
because he's not flaunting it. He's not flaunting it. He wants to daven nates every Shabbos. That's fine. That's fine. The bottom line is, like when you're with other people and you know you guys are, let's say you're at you're bowling or you're playing cards or you know whatever you're doing recreationally. And all of a sudden, if one of you were to say, "Oh, gotta daven mincha," and there's like 3 hours left to daven mincha, right? That's being firmer than thou. Okay, that's
About kashrus.
That's
Well,
overboard.
I don't eat rabbanos, I don't eat, I only eat land that so I guess you're talking about it if you're ehrlich about it, if you're ehrlich.
Well,
about
yeah,
it,
there's
if
a
you're
lot
not
of
ehrlich about
now
it, you're
there's
not-
because there's a lot of misinformation about hashgachas, and people out of ignorance just say, "Look, I don't know what to do, so I'm just not going to eat certain hechsherim." It depends how much of a fuss you make about it. If everyone else in your circle of family and friends is going to be extremely inconvenienced by your chumras, then you have to start thinking, am I doing the right